Letters from Iwo Jima tells the story of the famous World War II battle entirely from the perspective of the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army and of their leader, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Before and during this brutal battle, Kuribayashi faces many challenges: lack of resources, insubordination, and overwhelming numbers of American forces in comparison to the Japanese on Iwo Jima. Kuribayashi resists outmoded traditional battle techniques, adapts to unfriendly terrain, and despite ultimately losing the battle, makes a huge impact upon his men and against the enemy. Portrayed by Ken Watanabe in the film, Tadamichi Kuribayashi is a gregarious, reflective, unconventional military leader who shirks tradition and implements an attrition battle style in order to make the most of their limited manpower and resources. He aims to inflict maximum damage on the Americans in a desperate attempt to protect Iwo Jima from becoming a base from which the U.S. can attack Japan. Kuribayashi is a change-oriented or adaptive leader when the film begins. As Yukel writes, an adaptive leader is primarily concerned with understanding the environment, finding innovative ways to adapt to it, and implementing major changes and strategies. As soon as he arrives at Iwo Jima, he surveys the land in order to better understand the terrain, its challenges, and how to structure his strategy. Without this knowledge, he knows he cannot be successful in the battle. He imposes an entirely different strategy on their battle plans, disregarding their preparation for a beach-based attack and moving the men into the caves. Kuribayashi is also a good representative of ethical leadership. Rather than being behind giving commands, Kuribayashi fights alongside of his men. His values of honor in battle are reflected in his behavior and participation. As they move into the final battle, Kuribayashi says to his men, "I will always be in front of you." In battle, leaders often remain in the back where there is less action because their survival is paramount. Without a leader, there is disorganization and confusion. However, at the end of the film, Kuribayashi chooses to fight with his men at the front. Not only is this bold, it shows his men that he would not ask them to do anything he was not willing to do himself. This boosts morale and wins their respect. この島で敵を踏みとどめることが責務である。者々、10人の敵を倒すまで死ぬことは禁じる。生きて、再び祖国の地を踏めることなき者と覚悟せよ。世は常に所持の先頭にある。One of Kuribayashi's biggest strengths is his adaptive capacity. He resists long-standing military traditions and develops an entirely new strategy as the situation evolves. As Bennis says, leaders respond quickly and intelligently to relentless change. Speed is of the essence, and they must often act before all the data are in. Kuribayashi also has a weak need for affiliation. Despite being very loyal to Japan, he does not restrict himself to traditions he finds unsuitable for the battle at hand. He also reflects on his past and on himself throughout the film, represented by flashbacks. And Bennis stresses that reflection produces understanding. Because Kuribayashi had been to America and had seen their military and mass production capabilities, he knew that his men were vulnerable on the beach to American tanks and boats. Retreating to the caves proved much more advantageous. Finally, the general had very strong interpersonal skills, building relationships with his subordinates and asking about their feelings and sharing his own experiences as well. Kuribayashi's biggest weakness was a lack of communication about his overall vision and contingency plans. He had large changes to the normal operating procedures, but when there were crisis moments in the film, His lower commanders did not seem to know how to react in kind with Kuribayashi's wishes. He did not do a good job of laying out contingency plans for different battle outcomes. Rather than retreating as the general wanted, many soldiers committed suicide in accordance with military tradition. Kuribayashi also did not discipline or correct his followers who were resistant or openly defiant to his changes. He didn't remove or demote or even punish subordinates who resisted his orders. As a military leader under literal life or death situations, adherence to a strategy is key to success. By not having any reinforcement, in the midst of battle, there was mixed messaging and panic.
In the film, Kuribayashi uses expert power, where a leader uses their knowledge and expertise to influence the actions of the subordinates. As a general in the Imperial Japanese Army, Kuribayashi has a wealth of knowledge and experience. Conversely, the privates are young and inexperienced. Kuribayashi's influence was key because he had access to information that many below him did not, and therefore the ability to make the best and most informed decisions. For example, he knew about American military technology due to his experiences living in the United States. Thus, he was able to anticipate and plan around the Americans' military strategy. Kuribayashi also uses informational power by having control of the flow of information in and out of Iwo Jima. As a general, he receives information and commands from those above him in the army. Then, it is his job to articulate this information to his subordinates as is appropriate. For example, he receives a note that states there are no reinforcements coming. Kuribayashi is not quick to loudly broadcast this information, as it would hurt morale, but he does not lie about it. Instead, he uses this information to reconsider his position at Iwo Jima and what the best approach is given his numbers. Kuribayashi also uses inspirational appeals twice in the film as well to influence his subordinates by reminding them of their values. When the attack first begins and when it is about to end, he gives a short speech where he reminds the men to uphold the values of honor and bravery. He also reminds the men that he will always be in front, fighting with them, because he too values bravery. These speeches help to motivate the men and get them ready mentally and emotionally for what lies ahead. It is clear the battle will not be easy, but Kuribayashi needs his men to be ready to fight. Lastly, Kuribayashi uses referent power with Saigo, who has a strong desire to please him. While Kuribayashi does not develop a close bond with many of the characters in the film, he does with Saigo. Saigo seems to be an unwilling participant in this battle, based on his comments about just giving the Americans Iwo Jima. As a result, he is nearly beaten, but Kuribayashi saves him. He is also nearly beheaded by his superior for deserting, but Kuribayashi saves him again. As a result of these near-death experiences, Saigo has a great respect for Kuribayashi. Thus, when Kuribayashi asks him for favors, such as burning the letters or burying his body, Saigo complies because he wants to please him. Although Kuribayashi makes many efforts to influence his troops and honor Japan at Iwo Jima, they ultimately lose the battle and the war. One could argue that with the resources available to them, they could not have won the war with any leader or any leadership tactics. This unfavorable situation is exacerbated by the fact that many of his subordinates regard him as an American sympathizer. The men are therefore not quick to demonstrate their loyalty to Kuribayashi and often refuse to follow orders. For example, the men commit suicide in the cave after being ordered to rendezvous with other troops. Other men also choose to desert from the Japanese Imperial Army, even though it is widely regarded as dishonorable. Overall, Japan did lose at Iwo Jima. However, they also managed to inflict a large number of casualties and refused to go down without a fight.
Upon arriving on Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi is immediately faced with problems. There is very little water on the island, and much of it is acidic due to the sulfur-rich volcanic soil. The lack of water is a constant source of disease and discomfort for the Japanese. Furthermore, due to the loss of the combined fleet at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Kuribayashi now faces a severe supply problem. Without the fleet to support him, the island cannot be adequately resupplied or reinforced, and without additional troops, Kuribayashi's ill-equipped defensive forces are on their own and overwhelmingly outnumbered by 3-1. To compound the issue, over 50% of the island's air support has already been lost in supporting the defense of Saipan. The movie shows numerous occasions where Kuribayashi's subordinates resist his tactics and methods. His commanders believe him to be weak and pro-American, and assume that his deviation from conventional tactics is an attempt to limit American casualties. As the battle unfolds, many of his commanders disregard his orders to retreat and fight on, instead choosing to die at their posts by either committing suicide or mounting futile banzai attacks, essentially suicide by enemy fire. Kuribayashi continually struggles to maintain open lines of communication with his commanders during the battle. This presents a serious command and control issue that not only prevents him from transmitting orders, but also from receiving information regarding the enemy's advance. This forces Kuribayashi to lead blindly and keeps him from effectively deploying his forces. Kuribayashi spent several years in America studying with the U.S. military. This knowledge of U.S. tactics allows him to prepare differently than his other generals and prompts him to abandon the traditional beach fortifications the Japanese had employed in previous battles. Instead, fortify redundant fallback positions connected via tunnel networks. This allows his troops to remain well protected from American naval and air bombardment. From the first day he arrives, the movie highlights that Kuribayashi walks the island daily, inspecting the defensive positions and terrain firsthand. He quickly understands the advantages the terrain affords and even has his orderly perform mock assaults so he can properly site the best locations for gun emplacements. Based on his observations, he chooses to fortify Mount Suribachi, which overlooks the predicted landing sites. This will allow him to use his limited artillery to maximum effect against the enemy assault. While on his many walks, Kuribayashi views the island from the foot soldiers' perspective and advises his commanders on ways to improve their fortifications and living conditions. He also orders his general staff to eat the same rations as their men so they can better understand the physical limits and endurance of their troops. Kuribayashi also shows he can anticipate the enemy's movements by playing the battle from the enemy's perspective. He accurately predicts the enemy's strategy by envisioning how he would attack if he were on the opposing side. Kuribayashi knows that without support from Japan, victory is impossible. He takes this into account when planning his defenses and chooses a strategy of attrition that will make the enemy's inevitable victory as costly as possible. Although this strategy maximizes the effectiveness of his limited resources, it sharply contradicts Japanese warrior tradition, which insists an honorable death is preferable to retreat or surrender. His tradition-oriented commanders prefer to die at their posts by suicide rather than retreating to continue the fight.
Our team would have followed a similar path and would have made many of the same choices as Kuribayashi. Given the incredible lack of resources and overwhelming odds against them, we also would have pursued an attrition strategy and retreated into the caves. However, overall, we would have communicated our expectations, vision, and contingency plans very clearly from the outset. We would have had rendezvous points, backup plans, and different responses to different situations. For example, what to do if captured or questioned.
A key perspective when viewing the film was a cultural one. During World War II, Japan had a strict no-surrender policy. Even after Nazi Germany was defeated by the Allied powers, Japan continued to fight on, resulting in a bloody battle in the Pacific. This can also be seen in the film. By the end of the film, Kuribayashi knows that the last offensive will not win them Iwo Jima, but they continue on in order to serve Japan. In cultures outside of Japan, leaders might choose to surrender because they believe it is most right to save as many lives as possible. However, this was not the case for Japan. Becoming a prisoner of war was not an honorable choice. It did not serve Japan in their war effort. This relates closely to Japan's ideals of honor in death. The idea of honor in death can be traced back to feudal Japan and the rise of Bushido Code, or the way of the warrior. One of the tenets of Bushido Code was honor, specifically that there was honor in death, which can be seen in seppuku, or ritual suicide. There is a group of men who Kuribayashi commands to rendezvous with his forces, but their commanding officer decides to disobey. He feels that the most honorable course of action is to commit suicide with his men while they still can. Thus, they use grenades to end their lives. While the West does not always view suicide as honorable, Japan did. This was an important cultural perspective to keep in mind in order to understand why Kuribayashi's subordinates felt so strongly about resisting his commands. They did not do so in order to spite him. They truly believed what they did was right.
Regardless of what action Kuribayashi took, the loss of the island was inevitable against such staggering odds. However, a possible outcome of our proposed alternatives is potentially prolonging the battle with fewer useless losses from suicide. If the defensive strategy had been clearly communicated in advance, his commanders could have been able to act on his standing orders to retreat rather than waiting for orders during the battle, and had they done so, could have continued to fight longer. With a prolonged battle, his defensive strategy would have inflicted even heavier casualties on the enemy and further delayed their advance toward Japan. Alternatively, if his orders had been obeyed, more of his men may have survived and surrendered instead of committing suicide. If more men had been captured, it is possible that the Americans could have gathered information from these captives, which could have negatively impacted future battles for Japan.